Embassy. Thank you for joining us this evening. Despite the lovely weather outside, I'm glad you could all make it. We're very pleased to have you here. I will hand over the floor shortly to our Deputy Head of Mission, Sarah Cohen. Sarah, the floor is all yours. Thanks very much.
David, thank you very much. Good evening, friends, and thank you for joining us tonight, both in person here at the Embassy of Canada and online. Merci beaucoup d'être ici avec nous ce soir. Bienvenue à l'Ambassade du Canada. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 21st Annual Seymour Martin Lipset Lecture on Democracy in the World. We are very happy to continue our long-standing partnership with the National Endowment for Democracy. This is always a wonderful event, and we are delighted to act as host. The Seymour Martin Lipset Lecture on Democracy in the World was inaugurated in 2004 by NED and the Munk School of Global Affairs of the University of Toronto as a forum for discourse on democracy and its progress worldwide. The lecture is named for one of the great democratic scholars and public intellectuals of the 20th century. Lipset was also one of the most important comparative analysts of the two great democracies of North America and a strong advocate for US-Canada cooperation. As somebody who has the privilege to work to advance the bilateral relationship with Canada and the United States of America, and I think this is all the more poignant as we talk about the issues that we'll hear about tonight, it is an enormous privilege to work on a relationship whereby two partner nations are so deeply invested in the security and prosperity of each other. This is not a privilege that everybody has around the world. Will become very acute, of course, in our conversations tonight, and I think it is just worth recognizing whenever I have the opportunity. So thank you for indulging me. The Lipset Lecture has featured a number of fascinating and distinguished speakers since its inception, and this year, of course, is no exception. This year's lecture, David versus Goliath, Democracy and Autocracy in the Russo-Ukrainian War, will be delivered by Serhii Plokhii, the Mykhailo S. Hrushevs'kyi Professor of Ukrainian History and the Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. Professor Plokhi's interests include the intellectual, cultural, and international history of Eastern Europe, with an emphasis, of course, on Ukraine. His books have won numerous awards, including the Bailey Gifford Prize and the Shevchenko National Prize. He's the author of too many books to list here, but some highlights include The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, Chernobyl, The History of a Nuclear Catastrophe, and The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine. The Lipset Lecture is particularly timely as we have just marked 1,000 days since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And here, I really must emphasize, Canada reaffirms its unwavering support for the principles of Ukraine's 10-point peace formula, sovereignty and territorial integrity, adherence to the UN Charter, and respect for international law. Russia's claim to protect people in Ukraine is a false narrative. Russia is attempting to consolidate territory and legitimize a land and resource grab, redrawing borders by force. Furthermore, Russia continues to commit grave human rights abuses in temporarily occupied territories, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and sexual violence. Ukraine has endured unimaginable suffering due to Russia's brutal aggression, with countless lives lost and communities devastated. Despite these hardships, Ukraine has demonstrated unmatched resilience and determination in defending its land, culture, and people. This is nothing short of inspirational. The spirit and strength of the Ukrainian people inspire us all and reinforce our commitment to uphold the UN Charter and to stand with Ukraine. Canada stands resolute in its commitment to support Ukraine in defending its independence from Russia's brutal war of aggression. Our support to Ukraine will endure, ensuring a future founded on lasting peace, justice, and respect for international norms. Since Russia's unjustifiable and illegal full-scale invasion, Canada has committed over $19.5 billion in multifaceted support to Ukraine. An estimated 14.6 million people in Ukraine are expected to require humanitarian assistance in 2024. This accounts for approximately 40% of the population. And so this is why we have chosen to lead on the human dimension aspect of Ukraine's 10-point peace formula. This is why Canada is co-chairing with Norway and Ukraine a working group on the return of prisoners of war, detained civilians, and deported children. We work together with international partners to return all prisoners of war, civilians unlawfully detained by Russia, and unlawfully deported or forcibly transferred children. Canada very much is committed to protecting the best interests of children, bringing them back to their families and communities, supporting their return and reintegration, and ensuring such actions do not happen again. And so this is why, for example, we agreed to co-chair the Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children, and this is what the coalition aims to advance as a platform. We hosted, with co-chairs Norway and Ukraine, the Ministerial Conference on the Human Dimension of Ukraine's Peace Formula in Montreal, Canada, just recently, October 30th to 31st, 2024. 73 countries and international organizations from all continents participated in the conference. We welcomed the Montreal Pledge, seeking the return of prisoners of war, unlawfully detained civilians, and deported children, which has been signed by 51 countries and organizations to date, and counting. And so now, Canada's support for Ukraine and our solidarity with Ukrainians is ironclad. Their fight is our fight. We look forward to working with the US government and Congress in the year ahead to maintain allied unity of purpose here, including through our 2025 G7 presidency. And so, once again, thank you all for being here tonight to listen to the distinguished words from Serhii Plokhii. It is now my pleasure to hand over the podium to Damon Wilson, President and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Sarah and I had the pleasure of speaking back-to-back earlier this week at an event on Capitol Hill in honor of Uyghur culture and recognition of the genocide taking place. And it's an honor to speak back-to-back with you here in your home to talk about Ukraine. Canada's voice for democracy and human rights on the range of issues around the world is critical, and this is a perfect home for tonight's lecture. So on behalf of the National Endowment for Democracy, I want to welcome everyone who's here with us in person, who braved the weather, all of those who are joining around the world online. Welcome to the 21st Annual Seymour Martin Lipset Lecture on Democracy in the World. And this lecture is, as Sarah said, inaugurated in 2004. It's an example of what freedom needs around the world today. It's an example of working in common cause. And so this is a partnership that's been forged by the Endowment's International Forum for Democratic Studies with the University of Toronto, its political science department, and the Munk School of Global Affairs. And the embassy has been a gracious host of this lecture series from the beginning, something that's remarkable, and we really value that relationship. We value all the colleagues here who have helped make that possible. And shout out to your team as well as the NED staff for helping to do that. Now, this annual lecture, of course, honors Seymour Martin Lipset, one of the most renowned democracy scholars and public intellectuals of the 20th century. And this is really a fundamental event for the endowment each year, because we're set up as a foundation to provide support to groups around the world, but it's in the context of a battle of ideas. It's in the context of helping people understand the value and importance of democracy and freedom to human dignity and to our own country's interests and values. And so I want to start by just taking a moment to say how special it is to be joined and to recognize Sydney. Sydney Lipset is welcome. It's very beautiful to have you with us here tonight. Thank you for coming. A great friend of the endowment, great friend of this organization. She brings passion, commitment to the lecture every year. And I also want to acknowledge Carl, our founding president, Carl Gershman, who is here, under whose leadership this lecture began, and acknowledge our board members who are with us, Congressman Peter Roskam, who is with us, the founding editor of the Journal of Democracy, Mark Plattner, as well as Ambassador Kelly Curry. And I think we're joined by a former board member, Steve Stasanovich, if he is here with us now, and of course, Larry Diamond, the other founding director of the Journal of Democracy. We're grateful to have you here. We're grateful for your guidance along the way for so many in this room. And this lecture series has been made possible not only with the support of the Embassy of Canada, but Johns Hopkins University Press, the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and the University of Toronto Department of Political Science. So we'll soon hear from Professor Serhii Plokhii, who serves as the Mykhailo Hrushevs'kyi Professor of Ukrainian History and the Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. His work has been one of my guideposts in understanding and following Ukraine since you've been publishing. And it's quite fitting that he carries the title of the Hrushevs'kyi Professor as one of the greatest historians of Ukraine's modern time, and as someone who was such a key leader in Ukraine's national revival. And Serhii, in many ways today, I think that you play a comparable role as the greatest contemporary historian of the story of Ukraine, and such a key contributor to the thought leadership that goes in to the cultural and intellectual revival that we see among Ukrainians today, one that has so sadly been sparked by Putin's horrific war of aggression. And so this lecture, David versus Goliath, the struggle between Ukraine and the Russian aggressor, it's so integral to the mission of the Endowment. And it's through our support over decades, indeed since before the collapse of the Soviet Union, thanks to people like Nadia Duke, like Barbara Haig, the Endowment has been committed to helping Ukrainians, the Ukrainian people, to help themselves in their quest for dignity and democracy. Ukrainian society's aspiration for freedom is being directly assaulted by this full-blown war on Ukraine under Moscow's direction. And this war represents the most brutal, horrific outward expression of what is really Russia's global attack on freedom, an effort to undermine democracy around the world and undermine the idea of democracy around the world. So given the stakes, we believe that this year's lecture is especially timely. It's crucial for understanding the profound struggle in which we find ourselves and what it really means for all of us. At the Endowment, we understand it's a struggle whose outcome will shape the future trajectory of freedom for decades to come. So thank you again, thank you all for joining us. We're really looking forward to the lecture. But let me invite the person who's helped organize tonight, our Vice President for Studies and Analysis, Chris Walker, to do a more formal introduction of our lecture tonight. Thank you, Chris.
So thank you very much, Damon. It's my great pleasure to introduce this year's speaker to deliver the Seymour Martin Lipset Lecture. Serhii Plokhii is so well suited to deliver this lecture at this particular time. Sarah Cohen and Damon have already touched on aspects of Serhii Plokhii's biography. I'll touch on a few other aspects briefly. We know Serhii Plokhii is a leading scholar of Ukraine and the Cold War and is recognized as one of the world's preeminent experts on Ukrainian history. In 2007, Serhii Plokhii was named the Mykhailo Hrushevs'kyi Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University, and since 2013, he served as the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. As part of his formidable scholarship, he's published more than 20 books. Sarah Cohen alluded to a couple of them. I'll touch on several others. Ukraine and Russia, Representations of the Past, Yalta, The Price of Peace, The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, which won the 2015 Lionel Gerber Prize for Best Nonfiction Book in English. The Last Empire also won the Pushkin House Russian Book Prize that year. Other examples of Serhii Plokhii's published work includes Chernobyl, History and Tragedy, and the Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, for which Serhii Plokhii won the Arenberg Prize for History earlier this year. I think it's also worth noting that the Lipset Lecture has served as the glue for a long-standing and really quite wonderful relationship between the National Endowment for Democracy and the embassy here, and Canada more broadly. Each year there's a companion seminar that's held in Toronto at the University of Toronto. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize Professor Clifford Orwin and his colleagues for their leadership on this count. Serhii Plokhii was there last week to speak with the community at the university, and for the partnership we've had with the University of Toronto now over a 2-decade period. And it's all the more fitting that we have this relationship because Serhii Plokhii himself has a significant connection to Canada. Nearly 3 decades ago, he joined the staff of the University of Alberta's Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, where he founded the research program on religion and culture. He also served as Associate Director of the Peter Yatsek Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the University of Toronto's Must School, and it's worth noting that Serhii Plokhii is also a Canadian citizen. So I'm hopeful that our lecture this year may have special resonance with our partners in Canada and here at the Embassy. Over the years, the Lipset Lecture has consistently drawn some of the world's foremost scholars on critical questions relating to democracy, its progress, and the challenges emerging to it. And this year is no different, and we're so pleased to continue the tradition of distinguished speakers addressing the issues central to the condition of democracy. And this one is especially timely. Both Sarah and Damon alluded to this. I'll just say a brief word on it. Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine and the full-blown war that's been fought for more than 2.5 years has resulted in so much bloodshed and destruction. It is, as Serhii Plokhii describes it, a David versus Goliath struggle. And the David in this case is fighting for freedom on behalf of a far larger community. How this struggle plays out will have enormous consequences for the fate of democracy in Europe, the transatlantic community, and farther afield. Among others, decision makers in Beijing are keeping a very watchful eye on developments. So to help us situate this pivotal and complex challenge, it's my great privilege to welcome to the podium this year's lecturer, Serhii Plokhii, to deliver the 2024 Lipset Lecture on Democracy in the World.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introductions. Actually, 3 introductions. I never had such an honor bestowed on me, so I'm really honored. I'm also pleased. And as was already stated there, I started my career in North America in Canada, and I continue it now here in the United States at Harvard. So this particular sponsorship of the lecture is especially meaningful for me. The title, and you all know it, the title of today's talk is David versus Goliath, and it is there with that biblical story that I want to start the lecture. According to the story, a young shepherd called David defeated a giant called Goliath with the help of a sling and 5 stones. If you think about that story and Ukraine today and imagine Ukraine as David, one thing that is clear that the stones that David has at its command are partially made in Ukraine, like the drones that really changed the fate of the war on the Black Sea, including sea drones. Most of the weapons, most of the stones, the projectiles come from the United States and from the Allies. But what is really made in Ukraine is the sling. And the sling is made out of Ukrainians' determination to fight for democracy, to fight for sovereignty, to fight for independence. And it is that story of Ukrainian democracy that I want to focus on today, and the story in which it has been clashing with the autocratic regime in Russia, at least since the time of acquiring of its independence in 1991. What I'm going to do today, I will talk about the Russian-Ukrainian relations, looking at them through the prism of democracy and democratic developments in 2 countries. I will talk about the importance of democracy for today's Ukraine's fight for independence and the use and abuse of democracy by the aggressor in this war, the Russian Federation. And I will conclude with talking about what is actually at stake in this battle between David of democracy and Goliath of autocracy and autocratic regime. So this is the plan. This is a challenging environment for me, not only because it's Washington, D.C., but also because for the last probably 15 or 20 years, like every lecturer at the university, my lectures are comments on the pictures that I show to the audience. So now I have no assistance coming from the picture, from the images. We'll see how it will go, but I will try my best. In the minds of many of us, history had reached its end with the fall of the Berlin Wall. If not in Francis Fukuyama's understanding of that fall as the ultimate victory of liberal democracy, then in the form of the conviction that despite continuing rivalry between great powers, unprovoked invasions, followed by territorial annexations and large-scale military actions, had been relegated to the past, that this is not the big wars, the big conventional wars of the sort that Europe, the world were fighting in mid-20th century, that was impossible. There were, of course, wars in Chechnya, in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, and Iraq, but we preferred to ignore them. The rise of populism and authoritarian regimes, as well as authoritarian tendencies in democratic nations, suggested parallels with the 1930s, but most of us brushed them aside. The fall of the USSR, far from being a universal triumph of democracy, as was imagined back in 1991, was a victory to a different degree of nationalists, Democrats, and party apparatchiks, with their roles and ideologies varying from one former Soviet republic to another. In some cases, it was most conservative elements of the Soviet elite that consolidated power. Democracy was fully successful only in the Baltic states, where it turned out to be more durable and resilient to authoritarian pressures than even in the countries of the former Eastern Europe, former communist bloc, mostly notably Hungary. Democracy in the form of competitive elections survived in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia. There are serious concerns now here, Armenia, or concerns in Georgia, Armenia, and to a degree in Kyrgyzstan. An outlier among the Central Asian states in that regard. It never took off in the rest of Central Asia, including Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. In Belarus, the slide into authoritarianism began in the mid-1990s, after the election of Alexander Lukashenko as the president of that country. His regime became a virtual dictatorship by the year 2020, when he used unrestricted violence against peaceful demonstrators who protested the government's widespread electoral fraud committed to keep Lukashenko in power. In Russia, the beacon of democracy for the more conservative republics in the late 1980s and early 1990s, authoritarianism began to gather strength after the political crisis in the early 1990s. Russian democracy, probably the most popular in the world symbol of Russian democracy, comes with the photograph of Boris Yeltsin standing on the tank in front of the White House, the parliament building of the Russian Federation, defending democracy and defending the rule of law. Other picture taken only 2.5 years later, in the fall of 1993, coming from the same spot with the same building, and the tank there as well, but no Yeltsin there, and tanks firing at the symbol of Russian democracy. For Yeltsin, that battle in 1993, when tanks were firing at the White House, the name of the parliament, was the second battle for the White House. He won in both of those battles, but not Russian democracy. It survived in August of 1991, being faced with the Soviet tanks, but it didn't survive in the fall of 93, when the now Russian tanks were firing at the building. A few months later, in December of '93, Russian citizens voted on the new constitution drafted by Yeltsin's aides. "I won't deny it," said Yeltsin in one of the interviews. "The powers of the president in the draft are considerable indeed." "And what would you want?" asked Yeltsin. "In a country that has got used to tsars or chiefs, a country in which well-defined interest groups have not coalesced and their leaders have not been determined, in which normal parties are barely embryonic, a country in which executive discipline is exceedingly weak, where nihilism with regard to the law is completely rampant. In such a country, could one bet only or mainly on Parliament? Question mark. In half a year, if not sooner, the people are sure to demand a dictator. Such a dictator will be found quickly, I assure you, and perhaps in that very Parliament. So what Yeltsin was saying, that he was defending Russia from introducing really authoritarian constitution and enhancing the powers of the president. He was defending Russia from something much worse than authoritarianism, the dictatorial rule. In 2 years, 1 month, and 2 weeks, Russia all but ended its experiment with parliamentary democracy and laid the constitutional foundations for a strong presidential regime. In fact, that calculation, I mean the 2 years, 1 month, and 2 weeks between the what happened in August 1991 and then in the fall of 1993, in fact, that calculation exaggerates the length of the experiment, democratic experiment in Russia. Throughout most of 1992 and 1993, President Yeltsin ruled the country by decree. Born of the collapse of the USSR, Russian democracy founded on the rocks of Russian statehood. Yeltsin believed that he had the right and indeed the responsibility to choose his successor. The tryouts for president in what had become known as Operation Successor brought to power the former director of the Federal Security Service of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Let me now move to the other side of the Russian-Ukrainian border, move to Ukraine and see what is happening around the same time in Ukraine. The Gorbachev-era democratic experiment survived in the former USSR's second largest republic, which was Ukraine. The mid-1990s saw Russia and Ukraine parting ways in political development. Russia became more authoritarian with each passing year, while Ukraine stayed democratic despite repeated efforts of the presidential office, Ukrainian presidential office, to follow the Russian model and subordinate parliament to itself. Numerous factors contributed to this different outcomes, which would strongly affect relations between the two former senior partners in the Soviet project, Russia and Ukraine. I'll quote here from the work of well-known political scientists, Canadian political scientists at the University of Toronto, where he explains the success of Ukrainian democracy, electoral democracy, in the following way. Ukraine became the most competitive and democratic country in the Commonwealth of Independent States over the post-Cold War era, experiencing 4 electoral turnovers, a vibrant media, and repeated mass movements for political change. Ukraine's surprising pluralism was rooted in underdeveloped ruling parties, a weak authoritarian state, and national divisions between Eastern and Western Ukraine, wrote Lucan Way. He's a political scientist. As a historian, I would also add some other causes for the Ukrainian pluralism and Ukrainian democracy, or reasons for its survival. One of them was the history of Ukraine as the country being divided by different empires, which resulted in the creation of a country with strong regionalism and strong regional identity, and regions being also defined not only in terms of history, but also in terms of culture, in terms of the language, and to a degree a political tradition that existed in those regions. For those different regions to stay together and to survive, the only model that actually was available and the only model that worked was the democratic model, the model of democracy. Like it was with the early years of the American history here, the history of the United States, the history of the pilgrims and colonies that they created. No one region in Ukraine was strong enough or had enough power to impose its control over other regions. They were trying that. President Kuchma was trying that. President Yanukovych was trying that. And Yanukovych represented the most powerful, the biggest region in Ukraine, Donbass, which is now all but destroyed by the current war. Yanukovych was also the only president who didn't survive in office until the end of his presidential term. Leonid Kuchma, the country's second president, tried on numerous occasions to replicate the models of real destruction of democracy that were introduced by his counterpart, Russian counterpart, President Yeltsin in Moscow. None of that actually worked. He was trying to use referendum like Yeltsin did that to push through the constitution with the strong presidential powers, and it didn't work in Ukraine. There were mass protests, including the very strong position from the Ukrainian parliament. As a result, in '96, the Ukrainian parliament and the presidential office, they made a compromise and agreed on the constitution that left the parliament as a very important player in the Ukrainian politics, something that was taken, that role was completely taken away from the Russian Duma, from the Russian parliament. In the year 2004, Kuchma once again reached out for the Russian book, the rule book, in terms of trying to emulate what Yeltsin did by effectively appointing his successor. So President Kuchma's successor was supposed to be Viktor Yanukovych, the leader of the largest region in Ukraine. The way how you put the successor in power was, of course, through the rigged elections. So again, the model was very much provided by Russia. What happened in Ukraine was that the people said no. Out of that came the Orange Revolution. That was no, not just to Yanukovych, not just to Kuchma. That was no to the Russian way of how to handle the elections and how to suppress the democracy. Before stepping down as the president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma published a book with a telling title, Ukraine is not Russia. It's interesting that the first book launch took place not in Kyiv, but took place in Moscow, and the first version was in Russian. He certainly learned it a hard way that Ukraine was not Russia. And he was trying to convey that message also to Putin and other leaders in Moscow. If they got that message, they certainly didn't like it, given what happened after that. Ukrainian democracy presented a major threat to the Russian political regime, as it provided an example of a functioning political system with a strong parliament, which encouraged and empowered Russian liberal opposition to the increasingly authoritarian regime in Moscow. Apart from that, the Ukrainian democratic tradition and parliamentary system made it much more difficult for Russia to regain control over Ukraine. Furthermore, Western insistence on democratic rule as a prerequisite for good relations with the post-Soviet states privileged Ukraine in building long-term political ties with Europe and the United States. President George W. Bush's democracy crusade, or policies designed to promote and support democracy on a global scale, put Washington and Moscow on a collision course. Putin's regime found democracy promotion a threat to his own stability, or stability of his regime at home, and a threat to his political objectives abroad. The new Eastern Europe, which are the former Western republics of the USSR, became the site where those competing interests collided to the same degree as they did in the old Eastern Europe during the Cold War. I would suggest that it was a threat of democracy presented by the democratic developments in Ukraine and supported by the United States that has been a much more serious threat and continues to be a much more serious threat to the Putin regime than NATO enlargement ever was or ever will be. Because the threat of democratic development, that's a threat of the not of the aggression, not the attempt to somehow dislodge the regime from outside. The much bigger threat is, of course, for authoritarian regimes of all kinds, including the Russian one, or the attempts to dislodge that regime from below. When in early 2014, the Revolution of Dignity in Kiev overthrew the Moscow-backed corrupt regime of President Yanukovych, and the new government insisted on signing of the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union, Putin called the developments in Kiev a coup and moved his troops in the Crimea ostensibly in the defense of the rights of its Russian-speaking population. For me, as a historian who started my career looking at and studying the history of the region and European history in general of the early modern period, for me that the echo was of really Catherine II partitioning Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the democratic state in the center of Europe, ostensibly in defense of the Polish rights and freedoms. So the echo of this imperial, at least imperial rhetoric, one can hear it also in the argumentation that was provided by Russia in the year 2014, the year of the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War. The annexation of the Crimea and the start of the hybrid war in Donbass was conducted by Russia with flagrant violations of the international law, but also of the basic principles of democracy. More than that, the ostensibly democratic institution of referenda were used to justify the annexation of the territories, the first annexation of territory in history of Europe since 1945, since the end of World War II. The frightened members of the Crimean parliament were brought to the building of the Crimean parliament by the thugs led, among others, by Igor Girkin, who became known, infamously known, a few weeks, a few months later, starting really the full-out war, military violence in Donbass, in eastern part of Ukraine. Putin denied that he was planning to annex the Crimea, but 2 days after his words, the Crimean parliament, fully controlled now by Russia, changed its earlier decision because the original decision was to have a referendum on the extended rights of the Crimea in Ukraine. So after the establishment of the full control over the peninsula, the parliament, Russian-controlled, the parliament suddenly changes its earlier decision and revises the question for the forthcoming referendum, putting reunification of Crimea with Russia on the ballot. Within a very few short days, not even weeks, the referendum, so-called referendum, is being organized without, of course, oversight or presence of the international observers. And the results of that referendum really were astonishing in terms of the results that were announced by the authorities. 96.77% had allegedly voted in favor of reunification. So even during the Soviet times, the figures that were given for the participants in the elections, in the Soviet elections, or the participants of those who supported the Communist Party were not as high. On the following day, March 17th, the count was complete. Quite astonishing. And the Crimean parliament asked the Russian authorities to accept the peninsula as part of the territory of the Russian Federation. In an article published on the eve of the referendum, the Russian historian Andrei Zubov, a professor of the elite Moscow Institute of International Relations, compared the planned annexation of the peninsula to Hitler's Anschluss of Austria in 1938. He drew parallels between Hitler's vision of Greater Germany and Russia's reunification rhetoric, pointed out that both acts were justified to the public by the need to protect allegedly persecuted minorities. German in a little bit with the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, so he was talking, Zubov was not talking only about Anschluss, and Russian in the case of the Crimea. Zubov, of course, was soon dismissed, losing his prestigious position in the country's top diplomatic school, but he didn't lose his argument. He now is in immigration in the Czech Republic, continues teaching, and his very, very insightful lectures can be found on YouTube. When, in the summer of 2021, Putin began preparing for the all-out invasion of Ukraine, he published a pseudo-historical tract on the historical ties between Russia and Ukraine. I have written a lot on that tract and the Putin's views, which are going back to the Russian imperial historiography of the first half of the 19th century, to the textbooks for the Russian schools produced in the 1830s and 1840s, authored by Nikolai Ustryalov, who were trying to make a claim for the Russian rights for Ukraine and Belarus, for the territories that were engulfed by the Polish uprising of 1830. But what I want to point to today, in today's presentation on democracy, that the very same piece produced by Putin or by his aides on his instruction really betray the Russians' leader not just disappointment, but annoyance with such thing as a democracy. He complained in that text that presidents, meaning Ukrainian presidents, members of parliament, and ministers would change, but the attitude of separation from and enmity toward Russia would remain. That was allegedly the result of the political system established by the, I quote, Western authors of the anti-Russia project. What he had in mind was, of course, the ideas of democracy, blaming the United States, the West, for bringing those democratic values and democratic institutions to Ukraine, and of course complicating his life enormously. He had no problem making deals with the autocrats in the post-Soviet space and in Ukraine as well, including President Yanukovych. He was really waiting very much for the new and unexperienced leader to emerge, and that was Volodymyr Zelensky. And then by 2021, he writes that it doesn't matter, presidents change and the parliamentarians change, but the position is the same. And responsible for that is democracy. After the Russian full-out aggression against Ukraine in February of 2022, what we see is the Russians losing parts of the territory that they controlled at the beginning, at the start of the war, but they're trying to establish full control over other parts, including Donbass, eastern Ukraine, and parts of southern Ukraine, the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions of Ukraine, Oblast. It's north of the Sea of Azov. And again, they're reaching for the tool that they already have, the so-called referenda. They conduct, again, in the record time, referenda in the eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, and do the same on the occupied parts of the territory of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. The trick is that when they do that referenda, they don't control most of the population of Zaporizhzhia region. In a few weeks, in a few months, they would lose also control over Kherson, the capital of the region. But nevertheless, on the basis of this fake referenda, they put into the Russian constitution in the fall of 2022 the 4 Ukrainian oblasts, including the ones that they didn't control or didn't control fully, providing in that way a pseudo-democratic justification for what they have been doing. Probably most of you follow and have been following the news from Russia itself, where the Russian aggression against Ukraine was accompanied also by mass protests in St. Petersburg and Moscow and in some other cities of Russia as well. And what followed was a major crackdown on the Russian opposition, producing the largest exodus, political exodus from Russia since the time of revolution of 1917, leaving really no institutional base anymore, but also chasing out people who could be part of the democratic opposition to Vladimir Putin. If Russia was autocratic before the start of the war in 2022, it really became totalitarian in the course of this war. The very scenario that Boris Yeltsin allegedly tried to avoid and tried to deal with in 1993 was certainly materialized in the year 2023. Let me once again cross the border between Russia and Ukraine and look at Ukraine and what is happening there. The evidence that was provided by journalists like Natalia Gumenyuk and others about the Ukrainian resistance and the sources of that resistance already during the first months of the war suggested that many, if not the majority, of the Ukrainians on the front line, when they were asked what they were fighting for, they were also referring to things like democracy and freedom. They were not doing that to please the Western audiences or to make President Zelensky a little bit easier to use the democracy card to make a case for assistance or continuing assistance to Ukraine. They were doing that because many other options for them to explain to themselves and explain to the world what they were fighting for were not just available to Ukraine, because Ukraine is a country which created after 1991 a political nation. You can't say that you are fighting for religion because Ukraine is a multi-religious space. You can't say that you are fighting for a language because the war is being fought at least in 2 languages on the Ukrainian side. But what they're fighting for their right to control their land, to control their choices, and what they were told very often by the Russian officers. And again, there is a wonderful evidence coming also from the Reckoning project that is directed by Natalia Gumenyuk, why the war happened, because the Ukrainians made a wrong choice, electing the wrong president. This evidence it's interesting in its own right, but it's very difficult to say what the percentage of Ukrainians think that way, whether the journalists actually respond to the words that they're familiar to them and they think that would make a good article. But thankfully we have polling data also coming from Ukraine before the war and after the war. Olga Onuch wrote in October of 2022 in the Journal of Democracy. Some of you probably know this journal. She wrote, instead of losing confidence in democracy as the best form of government, Ukrainian citizens have done the opposite. Survey research reveals a staggering 35 percentage point rise in Ukrainian support for democracy over just 3 years. So between the year 2019-2020 and the year 2022. Another very interesting question that Ukrainian citizens were asked first in October of 2020 and then in December of 2023. The question was, what is more important for you? Is it the democratic system or the strong leader or the strong leadership? So in October 2020, 31% said that democratic institutions were more important for them. But 54% said that actually strong leader is more important. This is October 20. Now, fast track to December of 23. Those who believe that the strong leader is important, this is in the conditions of the war, and the leadership shown by President Zelensky at that time. Only 32% believe that the most important thing is having a strong leader. And 59% in December of 23 believe that the democratic system, the maintenance of democratic institutions is the most important value for them in that war. In this summer, in July 2024, 47% of Ukrainians choosing between what is more important for you, freedom or material well-being. Ukrainians asked really difficult questions. What is more important for you, freedom or material well-being? Well, 24% said that material well-being, 47% said that freedom is more important for them. What you actually have and what you see in these numbers, and they can be argued, this polling company was doing that, this methodology was used, or a different one. But whatever methodology is there, whatever polling company was doing that, that's an explanation of what happened in February and March of 2022. At that time, the United States and Moscow, the Russian Federation, disagreed on everything, especially over the issue of Ukraine. But there was one tacit agreement. Ukraine would not last for more than 3 days, for more than 4 weeks. The American nuclear scenario was that, okay, if Russia invades, US would provide support for the partisan warfare. So that was the extent of imaginations. And Ukrainians mobilized and Ukrainians fought back. and with very limited support also in terms of the military equipment all the way up until June of 2022. Where that resilience comes from? Well, that's one potential source. This polling data. This polling data about the importance of democratic institutions at the time of the war, which are more important than the personal leadership. The idea that the idea of freedom is actually more important than well-being under the conditions and circumstances of the war. The war that is fought in Ukraine, of course, is fought not only for Ukraine, it fought also for the principles of the international order. It is fought for the values, including democratic values. On side of Ukraine are exclusively democratic countries. So it is a democratic bloc that is fighting today in Ukraine. Not all of democracies are in that corner. The largest democracy in the world, Indian one, is actually sitting on the fence, trying to make extra money, selling oil and gas to Europe, and apparently now it's one of the biggest exporters of Indian gas, or gasoline at least, to Germany. So there are very serious issues about not only the unity of the democratic bloc, and this is just one of the examples, but also to what degree there is an understanding of the importance of the war in Ukraine for the future of democracy worldwide and in the United States, in Canada, in Germany, in France, in any of the major supporters of Ukraine in this war, because Ukrainians are fighting the war for democracy, they're fighting the war for us as well. We don't know what will happen to the Ukrainian democracy as the result of this war. The figures that I gave you are very, very optimistic and very encouraging. But the war is also the time of centralization out of necessity. The war is also the time when you can't conduct elections, like the Ukrainian elections for the president were missed according to the Ukrainian constitution, but also according to the overwhelming position taken by Ukrainian society. So democracy and what will happen in Ukraine is still at stake. And I'm talking about the regions of Ukraine that are today and would remain under Kyiv's control. Think about Crimea, think about Donbass, think about southern Ukraine. Democracy is the word that is not applicable there in any of its incarnations. The future of democracy in Russia. I started with talking about 1991 and Yeltsin on the tank, and the world being excited really about Russia going democratic. It didn't happen. And now we know that democracy in the country that has no democratic traditions will not come overnight. Those were illusions. We have to put those illusions aside. And this rhetoric about Russian democracy is still very much prevailing. What is possible is certainly a more liberal regime in Russia that would allow political parties and institutions to exist. And that is what is at stake in this war in Ukraine. And the impact that it will have, the outcome of the war will have on the world as a whole, democratic and non-democratic, it's something that there are volumes and volumes have been written about that. On the importance of the outcome of the war in China and Chinese behavior toward Taiwan, and also the potential encouragement of the Putin friends in Europe and beyond Europe as well, which are anything but represent anything but democratic values and democratic traditions. So Ukraine is fighting today for democracy, not only at home but also abroad. And for the sake of us all, the David of democracy has to defeat the Goliath of authoritarianism. We know how the biblical story ends. David emerges victorious. We don't know how this story will end, but it depends on that outcome of that battle depends on all of us, and our future depends on the outcome of the battle. Thank you very much for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Serhii. What a remarkable tour de force of where we are. And the professor, in your latest book on the Russian-Ukrainian war, you sort of say how awkward it is as a historian to be writing in real time a history of a war that's ongoing and hasn't ended. But let me just pick up on some of the remarks you said. As a historian, how do you see and assess how the war is changing Ukraine? In some respects, there's a 370-year setback for Russian interest from the Pereslav Agreement between Russia and Cossacks, in which a Ukrainian nation is actually united in opposition to Moscow. You talked about some of the regional divisions in which a war has actually bridged some of those divides. And you talked about a stronger attachment to the concept of freedom and democracy among the Ukrainian people. So while this war is hardly over, can you say a word as a historian about how you're assessing how this war is changing Ukraine, changing the Ukrainian people? And I think, given our room, you're going to have to...
Thank you for this question. First of all, I'm reasonably satisfied with my presentation without PowerPoint, so somehow I survived.
So are we.
Yeah.
So are we.
Thank you for this question. I remember after the events of Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine, one of the buildings on Maidan caught fire. It was under renovation for a long period of time, and it was covered with canvas, where there was this slogan, "Freedom is our religion," and it was only slightly exaggerated statement. Looking at the history of Ukraine, one thing that certainly come to the fore is the importance of democratic traditions. They come with certainly one of the founding myths of Ukrainian nation, the history of the Cossacks, and that history has very many elements and parts, good and bad. But in the national founding myth, the Cossacks are there as representatives of democracy and representatives of freedom. And while it's basically impossible, and it would be probably irresponsible for any historian to try to really connect somehow 17th or 16th century democracy within the Cossacks with what is happening in the 20th century. But it would be also equally irresponsible to dismiss the founding myth as something that has no relation. So it almost doesn't matter who the Cossacks were and what they were doing, but it matters how they were imagined in the 19th century, how they imagined today. And when you think that the founding myth of the nation is about freedom and resistance and revolt and rebellion, that tells you something about people who have this imagination, who think in those terms. Moving closer to the more facts on the ground and more things that we can feel to a degree as historians, you see really a long tradition also of the Polish nobility democracy that is there in Ukraine. You see the tradition all the way into the mid-19th century of the self-government, the Magdeburg Law. So there are things that I imagined and they're important, but there are also some real things that certainly can help to explain Ukrainian Ukrainian freedom and tradition of that freedom. And what happened during this war happened something really very important. Ukraine acquired its independence in December of 1991 by going to the referendum, to the ballot box by voting. 92% of the population voted for independence. But it's one thing when you actually go and vote, and then maybe you change your mind or not change your mind. It's another thing when you take up arms to defend your choice. And that's what changes in the war. So the people are prepared not just spend additional hour or two to go in line and vote, which is very important for democracy, but they're prepared to take up arms to defend their choice. So that's the change. That's a new quality. That's a new development.
Thank you. It seems like such, in some respects, as people worry about the situation on the ground, rightly so, historically such a strategic defeat for Russian interests to have turned the Ukrainian people against Moscow. Let me come back to your lecture is David versus Goliath, and you've talked about the sling being the determination of the Ukrainian people. And it's pretty clear in the story that that shot stopped Goliath, took him down. What do you think stops Vladimir Putin here?
Well, by now it is very clear that David needs a lot of support. By now it's not just enough the Ukrainian determination keep fighting, which by the way is not given. We know that the war is approaching its third year. That is the support of the democratic allies is extremely important, not only in terms of providing weapons that are needed and allowing Ukrainians to use those weapons, because till recently some weapons that were promised were not delivered, those that were delivered were not allowed to be used. But the very fact of that support and assistance, this is a big moral support, a boost to the Ukrainian morale. Now Ukrainians need allies, the West, to support their morale. In 2022, it was the Ukrainian morale that inspired others. So now Ukraine needs that support as well. And I have no doubt that if democracy cares about itself, about democratic governments, about their own long-term interests, there is nothing impossible in stopping Putin in Ukraine today. Because if you don't stop him in Ukraine today, we know the trajectory. It started with Chechnya. Or rather, it started with shooting the White House with President Clinton congratulating him on his victory. Going to Chechnya, after Chechnya there would be Georgia. After Georgia there is Crimea. After Crimea the attack on entire Ukraine. If the response to Chechnya would be half of what it was to Georgia, there would be no Georgia. If response to Georgia would be half of what happened with the Crimea, there would be no Crimea, and so on and so forth. So not stopping now, it's actually delivering victory to Putin, victory to the authoritarian regimes, and it means actually accepting the defeat not only of Ukraine but of democracy and democratic values, when there is no reason for that at all. Russia is not even member of the 10 largest world economies. That's about the will to defend the values that are certainly very, very important for any democratic country.
I think that's one of the important things, the perspective of a ruble that collapsed, or Russia, the reserves are depleted, the manpower challenges, a dependence on North Korea and Iran. But you said that one of the biggest threats to Russia was Ukraine's democracy, its success. And Ukraine comes through this with a stronger attachment to freedom, although there are challenges, as you said, about its own democracy. But how do you think about, you put a lot of blame on President Yeltsin, both winning in both struggles, and yet through that process, democracy taking a real hit in Russia. And so how do you think about the support that Alexei Navalny received with folks that wrote him so many letters when he was in prison, the voices that you hear of Vladimir Kara-Murza, Yashin, the largest exodus of Russians out of Russia because of this concern, understanding that the real threat to Putin is a democratic approach. How do you think this war affects the possibility, the trajectory of democracy in Russia?
Yes, well, first of all, the brave people who in Russia mobilize against the war and mobilize against the regime deserve all support we can give them. That's one. That's where that is important and important to do now. The second thing are the lessons that I think we all should learn from the Cold War, but also from the situations in other parts of the world in general. A major figure in the Russian resistance to the communist regime, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, received Nobel Prize. He was living here in the United States. He was welcomed with an address at Harvard. It was quite controversial, but Mr. Solzhenitsyn was a good Russian nationalist. The fingerprints of Mr. Solzhenitsyn are all over this current war waged by Putin today. The occupation of southern and eastern Ukraine, it is in Solzhenitsyn's writings. So the point that I am trying to make is that I wouldn't rush to call any opposition figure in Russia or anywhere else to be a committed Democrat. And then we would have actually much less disappointments and much more realistic expectations from Russia, from Ukraine, from Poland, from any other country.
So let me try to comment. Let's see, got it? Testing. All right, I think the other one might have been better. Let me grab yours for 1 second. Is that working? There it goes. There it goes. We'll need to come to close on this conversation soon, but the war is taking place in a time with tectonic plates shifting. So first, globally, we've just seen the collapse of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria. Is this off again? Yes, testing. Here we go. We've just seen the collapse in Syria of Bashar al-Assad and what this potentially means for Russia's interest. We see the future of Georgia in play. Will it be a Russian vassal state or not? We see a precarious nature of what's unfolding in Venezuela, the most well-documented stolen election by Maduro, and yet real signs of trouble there. A Russia that's dependent on a China, Iran, North Korea for this. How do you see these global factors sort of affecting the environment for the war in Ukraine, for potential for the coming peace talks, if there are peace talks?
Yes, the news that were coming from different parts of the world in the last two and a half years, if not all, the majority of them were bad not only for Ukraine, bad for democracy. Russia found the way to deal, as I already mentioned, with India, not only with China, to get around sanctions. Certainly Russia before that was winner in Syria as well. What we see in the course of the last maybe half of a year, plus minus, it seems to me the tide is turning. The tide is turning, and that's where the people in Georgia refuse to accept the form of quote unquote democracy, really dependency on Russia that is being imposed on them, refuse to accept a narrative that promoted by Russia and by the government in Georgia today, that it was the Georgian responsibility for the war, for the Russian aggression against Georgia. We see what is happening today again in Syria. The same story. They toppled regime, authoritarian regime, dictatorial regime that lasted for more than 1 decade, at least 2 generations, which is plus. It is loss for Russia. It is loss for Iran, certainly. But once again, we have to be careful and not imagining that people who topple those regimes are born democrats, and that democracy and bringing democracy to the place is the only goal that they have. But the defeat of Assad regime overall, looking globally, this is good news for democratic alliance, good news for democracy.
So let's close just on your concept of how to think about durable peace for Ukraine. There's a lot of talk about peace talks, although it's not necessarily coming from Ukrainians. It's hard for me to see a durable peace as long as Vladimir Putin's in the Kremlin or as long as Ukraine is outside of NATO. As a new administration takes shape here, a new Congress, the discussions about the potential for negotiations, how do you see the possibility of a durable peace that actually protects Ukrainian sovereignty?
The durable peace in Ukraine or anywhere else is possible only on the foundations of international law and international norms. If they're not there, there is basically a potential for that peace not being durable. As simple as that, right? The annexation normally is not recognized by a country whose territory was taken over. There is no peace treaty even today between Russia and Japan. Those things can take long period of time. Eventually they're resolved one way or another. The relations between Northern and Southern Korea, we know how contentious they are. The relations between South and North Vietnam, people, probably 99% of people don't remember that, but certainly know what I'm talking about. So really durable peace that would last, there is international law. That's where it will be based. Everything else, it's questionable. It can be there, but it also has the seeds of the destruction of the order that is established on violation of somebody's rights, on the violation of the international law. That not to say that the realities on the battleground, on the battlefield, they dictate decisions that we have to make today, that certain decisions can be temporary and sometimes should be accepted as temporary ones. So I'm not actually trying to say that the only solution this year or that next year can be internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. There can be other solutions as well. But long-term, durable peace, yeah, you have to go back to the basics. You have to go back to the internationally recognized borders.
Professor Plokhii, thank you for helping so many people understand Ukraine and what's at stake. Please join me in thanking Professor Plokhii for the lecture. It's a real honor, real honor.